Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to be talking about the Scant 1/4 inch and everything you need to know as a designer to kind of treat it properly in your quilt patterns. With modern quilters, a lot of people see this as just kind of another quilt police rule, something that, people are just trying to impose on them for the sake of making it more difficult. That's not entirely true when it comes to the Scant 1/4 inch, and I think the reason a lot of people have that perception about it is because they don't really understand where it's coming from or why it might be important. Now, that doesn't mean you always have to sew with a Scant 1/4 inch and you always have to deal with this in your pattern. Again, that's going to leave you with a lot of grumpy, kind of more modern beginner quilters because a lot of them just don't want to deal with the Scant 1/4 inch. But as with all rules, you kind of have to know the rule and understand the purpose of it before you can break it. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk through everything you need to know about a Scant 1/4 inch as a designer so that you can write patterns with this in mind in order to make a really seamless experience for your customer where they don't have to worry about this anymore. So to fully demonstrate what exactly the Scant 1/4 inch is and where it's coming from, I am going to just use a couple of pieces of cardstock here. The Scant 1/4 inch really stems from the fact that fabric is not 2D, even though we like to think of it that way. It does have a thickness to it, and when you start to fold it, that fold actually eats up some of your fabric. And so the Scant 1/4 inch is basically accounting for that fabric that is lost in the fold. Every time that we sew a seam and we have to press the seam one direction or another or press it open, it doesn't really matter what you're doing here. We're folding some amount of fabric and the fold itself is going to eat up some of that dimension. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to take one of these pieces of fabric and just to kind of show you, this thing is exactly 4 inches square. And I've been very, very careful to cut it pretty much exact here because I really want to demonstrate what's going on. So what I'm going to do is basically mark a 2-inch line on it. And I'm going to fold it right at that line. And then we'll measure it after I folded it. And what you'll be able to see is that we're not actually exactly 2 inches like we should be because that fold actually ate up some of our fabric. Let me go ahead and fold it. And this is fairly tricky just because we're working with cardstock here. Okay, so we started with a 4-inch piece of fabric. I folded it exactly in half at the 2-inch mark. Let's measure it and see what we got. Math would tell me that this should be exactly 2 inches wide. Do you see what's happening here? We're not at 2 inches. And obviously this is very exaggerated because we're working with cardstock here that is very, very thick compared to fabric. But this is exactly what's happening anytime you sew a seam. And there's nothing you can do about it. This is going to happen no matter what you do. This is just pure physics. We can't alter physics, or at least I can't. I don't know about you. So this is why the Scant 1/4 inch is important. This is happening no matter what we do. So as quilters, if we want to get accurate seams and accurate piecing, we've got to compensate for it somewhere. Now, we can do that either at the cutting stage or at the sewing stage. But really, when it comes down to fabric, we're talking about a couple of fibers, right? A couple of widths of thread. It's a very, very small amount. And all of our rulers are 1-inch grids, right? So how are you going to just cut everything slightly scant? It's not really feasible, right? And so traditionally in quilting, the way that we compensate for this fabric that's getting eaten up in the fold is by sewing a slightly scanter seam allowance. And that's the origin of the Scant 1/4 inch. So what a lot of people don't understand, first of all, is that this thing's not optional. I had one client that wanted me to draw curve templates for her. Very standard thing. I do a lot of templates for folks. But she made this comment when she was describing what she wanted me to do. And she's like, I don't sew with the Scant 1/4 inch. I don't want any scant seam allowances. And I get where she's coming from, but at the same time, it's kind of an odd comment to make because you don't get a choice over this. This is happening no matter what. This is just physics. So you can either choose to compensate for it or you can choose to ignore it. Sometimes you can get away with that. Sometimes you can't. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But you can't just say, I don't sew a Scant 1/4 inch seam and just ignore it and be fine because these physics are active whether or not you acknowledge them. The second thing, and what I've seen a lot of lately, are people talking about how to sew a Scant 1/4 inch and tutorials on that, right? Little challenge classes, free courses, things like that, where they'll basically demonstrate setting your machine up for a Scant 1/4 inch by just measuring it on your machine bed. that also doesn't work. And the reason for that is because the scant 1/4 inch is coming from your fabric folding, right? It's coming from your seam and your fabric folding. And so both of those things are going to matter with how much you need to move your needle and how scant you need to sew your seams. If you're working with like a broadcloth or a linen that's a little bit thicker and you're using a chunkier cotton thread, you're going to need to sew a scanter seam allowance than you will if you're using a really, really, really fine poplin with very, very thin 80 weight polyester thread or something along those lines, right? And so you're also going to have to compensate more if you press your seam to a side. If you're not very good about making sure your seams are fully extended as you're pressing them, there's a lot of things that can go into this. And so the only surefire way to make sure that you have calibrated your machine for the way that you sew and press is to sew fabric, press it, and then measure. And then you either increase or decrease your seam allowance based on that and get your machine set up for the way that you sew. The way you need to sew a scant 1/4 inch is very different from the way somebody else needs to sew a scant 1/4 inch, even if you're using the same fabrics, right? This is the physics of what we're dealing with. And we can either acknowledge it and write our patterns to allow for things that compensate for this scant 1/4 inch, or we can ignore it and just kind of hope for the best and end up with patterns that our clients might be running into issues on. So let's talk about when you need to really pay attention to this scant 1/4 inch and when you don't as a designer.
So when does a scant 1/4 inch actually matter? Well, one of the things is with any kind of skinny strip. So what's a skinny strip? I would say anything less than an inch or an inch and a half. That's going to be a skinny strip. If you don't sew with a scant 1/4 inch, you're going to have issues, right? Because you're going to lose too much of that strip from a percentage standpoint in the seam allowance to end up with blocks that will give you the right dimensions in the end. And so anytime you're doing like a lot of strip piecing with skinny pieces, scant 1/4 inch matters. It matters a lot. It also matters anytime you have small pieces. So again, anything that's like inch, inch and a half, around that range. When you start sewing those pieces, if you're not sewing with a scant 1/4 inch, again, you're going to lose a huge chunk of that from a percentage standpoint, and your whole entire block's going to end up shrinking. And then if you're trying to match it up with bigger pieces, they're not going to fit. And then the last piece of this are any kind of seam that doesn't have a correction step. So what's a correction step? Generally, that's going to be a trimming step. And I see this a lot with like curved templates, right? You'll sew a curve. A lot of people struggle keeping those accurate. Sewing with a scant 1/4 inch seam, it happens, right? It's totally fine. But then they'll trim up the block, which is fine, but you need to account for that with your seam allowances. If you don't trim it up and you don't sew with a scant 1/4 inch, especially if it's a piece on the smaller size, you're going to have problems. It's just the way it is. You're going to get ripply blocks. You're going to get blocks that aren't the correct size, that don't fit together the way that they're supposed to. And as you start sewing more and more pieces together, those problems get exaggerated and they show up more and more and more. And so if you've ever been the beginner quilter, which we all were at some point, where you've got your blocks, right? And then you start sewing them together. And now, this row is longer than that row. And you get these puckers and divots and ripples, and it just doesn't want to lie flat anymore. And the thing's an absolute pain in the butt to quilt. That's coming from not keeping a consistent seam allowance. So if you've got, beginner quilters that can't sew a scant 1/4 inch, you don't want to deal with that particular issue in your pattern. That's fine, but you're going to need to include correction steps, right? Areas where you trim up and square up, and you also need to add in options for that, right? So you need to make your pieces slightly larger than what they actually need to be, so there is actually room to trim. What I have found is that a lot of quilters don't want to deal with it themselves, partially because their readers, their customers don't like dealing with the scant 1/4 inch, but also there's not really an understanding of what it is and why it's actually important. My mantra, you kind of have to know the rules to break the rules. There's a reason some of these kind of best practices in quilting exist. And yes, there's some times where you can ignore them, but just kind of burying your head in the sand because either you don't understand it or you just don't want to deal with it, that doesn't help your customer. That doesn't mean you have to put in your before you begin instructions that you have to sew with the scant 1/4 inch and just kind of leave your customer hanging either. But there's some things that we can do to kind of help correct for folks that don't understand a scant 1/4 inch or don't want to sew with a scant 1/4 inch so that their project's still successful. And that's really the mark of a good pattern writer versus an amateur, right? Thinking about these things and putting in those pieces to your quilt pattern to make this really a seamless experience for your customer.